Fiona Tuomy is a writer, director and producer based in Melbourne. Over the last 20 years, she's also worked in a diverse range of leadership and educational roles across the arts, screen, literary and disability sectors. As writer and director, her documentary Helen Garner's Monkey Grip recently screened on ABC TV. Since July 2012, Fiona has been a mentor in residence on Writability Program for Writers with Disability, a partnership between Writers Victoria and Arts Access Victoria. Also, Fiona is currently a creative consultant and writing workshop leader on the Dangerous Deeds History of Disability Advocacy exhibition for Start Collective, funded by Australia Council and Creative Victoria.
We walked into town in the stifling dry air. The cool change came racing up Burke Street behind us, out of a dirty yellow sky. That's a quote from Helen Garner's book Monkey Grip, published in 1977 by McPhee Gribble, and inspired by events in Melbourne from 40 years ago. In 1976, when Helen would ride her bike daily to the Latrobe Reading Room at the State Library to write what would become Monkey Grip and what she hoped might be her first published novel, our local literary landscape was a very different place. It would have been hard to imagine back then that one day Melbourne would be designated a UNESCO City of Literature. As back when Helen was writing Monkey Grip, our culture was still deeply influenced by British culture. Local publishing opportunities were limited, and most writers, who were mainly men, would look to have their books published in England first. Last year, as Nellie said, I made the documentary about Helen Garner's Monkey Grip, which screened on ABC TV. For me, a big part of Monkey Grip is about a particular time in Melbourne when Australia was searching for its own artistic, political and cultural identity. In the 1970s, a new Australia was emerging, and when Gough Whitlam became Prime Minister, artists were at the forefront of the revolution. And I think, given our current context of federal government, I'd just like to say again, that's right, artists were at the forefront of the revolution. I believe as writers, artists, filmmakers, designers, as creative people, we can help create and shape the city we want to live in. Also, as Nellie said, for the last 3 years, I've been mentor in residence for Writability. It's a program for writers with disability. It's a partnership between Writers Victoria and Arts Access Victoria, and it's based at the Wheeler Centre up in Little Lonsdale Street. Before the advent of Writability, writing programs for people with disability in Victoria were few and far between. Examples of successful Australian writers with disability are rare, and deaf writers even more so. Consequently, the number of authentic voices recording the stories of the lived experience of disability has been limited. The Writability ethos has been built around the importance of self-told stories, disability leadership and peer support, and the creating of opportunities for even the quietest voices to be heard. I'm told by David Riding, who's the director of Melbourne's City of Literature office, that out of all of the other international cities of literature, I just should say Melbourne was the second city of literature, but last count there are 11 cities. Melbourne is the only city to offer a Writers with Disability program, making our program in Melbourne an international best practice model. A big part of the success and sustainability of the Writability program is it has been based within the City of Literature Creative Hub at the Wheeler Centre, placing an inclusive arts program for writers with disability in the midst of mainstream literary organisations, including Writers Victoria, Express Media, the Emerging Writers Festival, the Melbourne Writers Festival, Australian Poetry, the Small Press Network, the Wheeler Centre and the City of Literature office means many things, but particularly that we can try to work together so that writers with disability are not continued to be marginalised. At this year's Emerging Writers Festival, I hosted a closed forum on writers with disability, and I'd like to read from our statement, just part of it, written by Jackie Brown. We want to change and challenge perceptions of who we are as people with disability. We are not objects of inspiration or tragedy. We are complex and whole individuals, leading full and rich and messy lives. We want to break down these stereotypes, these meta-narratives of disability, by having our writing published in the mainstream. We want to read and write stories of disability pride, of sexuality, of parenting, of teenage angst, of falling in and out of love, of the intersections of identities, of being queer and disabled, of being Indigenous and disabled, or the plethora of other identities one can have. We want to proclaim the disabled body as desirable, to read and write stories which show disability as a valuable part of our person, not something to be afraid of or ashamed of. Such misconceptions can only be broken down if we are published and published wildly, and in accessible formats so that people with a variety of disabilities can have access to and enjoy text. Like any minority, we want to tell our stories ourselves because that is where empowerment and societal change happens. We are tired of others writing about us. It's time to get our voices out there. If we happen to be written about others who don't live the experience of disability, we want to be consulted in the same way that the Indigenous communities are consulted about how to address Indigenous stories and issues. This is for Stella too. Nothing about us without us. I love Melbourne and I love that we are a city of literature. And I wonder who at the moment may be sitting in the La Trobe reading room at the State Library, writing what may become Australia's next great novel, or who may be sitting there starting to write for the first time. I want Melbourne to be a city where all our many diverse voices are heard, a city which is accessible and where everyone is included. I didn't get the bell.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Lynda Roberts, who is our second City of Melbourne representative. She's the Public Art Program Manager at the City of Melbourne, recently delivering the Public Art Framework 2014 to 17. Do we get to say 14 to 17 or we still have to say 20? I don't know. And is currently developing a suite of new initiatives, including test sites and the Biennial Lab. Prior to managing Public Art Melbourne, Lynda worked as Arts Manager and Academic at RMIT University and Principal of Public Assembly, an art and design practice focused on the social dynamics of public space. She brings to the role a background in architecture, experience in the creation of cultural events within the public realm, and a passion for collaborative processes and temporal outcomes. You were really hard to find a song for, but I thought, given you like time and space, and some other things which I'm pretty confident I don't understand. I'm giving you a song about anxiety, modernity and the city. My Anxiety, Modernity and the City by a band I'm drawn to but don't really understand. Interzone by Joy Division. Ladies and gentlemen, Lynda Roberts.
I think my manager, Shawna Johnson, would appreciate that song somehow. Okay, I've got slides. So I've got to make sure I get through them in the 5 minutes. Okay, the goal to be a creative city is at the heart of what drives Public Art Melbourne. And we're very fresh and new. We've only been out and about for the last, just on a week. We launched last Wednesday. Our new Public Art program aims to encourage risk-taking, celebrate diversity, build vibrant creative communities and foster a more surprising and energising city. So they're big aims, but you know we're embarking. We've got pretty ambitious kind of things that we're aiming for. Public Art Melbourne wants to welcome debates and lively conversations, and Public Art does that pretty well in this city. So we've got a great legacy that we can draw on. We aim to inform, inspire, and amuse, and to bring new ways of seeing or being. One of our newest initiatives, Test Sites, is all about this. It's inspired by Melbourne's already robust public domain. And it's an opportunity for artists to develop their creative visions and contribute to a public art arena that we hope is set to thrive into the future. One of the 6 key goals of Melbourne Arts Strategy is activation. So if you've got this book, you would see that in there somewhere. These goals were developed as a result of extensive community consultation, as you know, and the Public Art Melbourne framework, which was endorsed late last year, was a direct response to the goals set out from the Melbourne Art Strategy. So we're really, really lucky. One of the first things that I did coming on board to the City of Melbourne was having the art strategy and all the conversations that had already happened to use as a foundation in the writing of the Public Art Melbourne framework, which was really great to have. Test Sites is about artists being supported to activate and engage with the public realm. It's about helping artists to bring our city spaces to life and supporting this activation. We want artists to think of Melbourne's central city as their own studio. With experimentation and testing of ideas in the laneways, streets and public spaces, in between the buildings and where you live, work, eat and shop. Test Sites is a responsive program. While developing the new program, we heard how hard it is for artists to create works in the public domain, and I know that myself as a practitioner in the past. It's bloody difficult. And we recognise that sometimes collaborating with the city to create public art can be a lengthy, iterative process. We've recognised that the City of Melbourne is in a unique position to make it easier for artists to work in the public domain. And I hope to make the city more porous with this new program. Test Sites is built as a quick response opportunity. So it's set up to open for new rounds every 6 weeks. So it means that artists can apply to explore their creative visions with us through a simple online application, and we hope a very simple visual essay kind of acquittal. Each round, successful artists will receive up to $3,000 of seed funds, mentoring from experienced artists and advice from the Public Art Melbourne team on how to negotiate city spaces and obtain permits. And that also includes talking to building owners, so being able to install your work and opening up conversations, sometimes in a city that seems very difficult to know who to talk to. It's also about being artists being responsive to the city as well. So it's kind of multiple tiers of responsiveness, really. Sites chosen for creative experimentation by artists will be unique to our city, and artists will be encouraged to respond to the particular city site that they've chosen to work with. So we're encouraging site specificality and responsiveness. But Test Sites is not just about funding. Public Art Melbourne is here to support artists with workshops, information sessions, and support to negotiate details like permits to work in the Melbourne central city spaces. Test Sites is designed to increase the capacity of artists to work confidently in the public domain. And workshops so far have been locked in with experienced artist mentors, and we're really excited to have these artists on board, whose work has been featured in this presentation. So this includes Cameron Robbins, who's running the first workshop at the end of this month, on the 28th of August, Bianca Hester, Ash Keating and Jason Mailing, and it's just really great to be able to work with them over the program in the forthcoming year. Test Sites is about ideas and innovation. It's about recognising the creative process by which artists perceive our city, enhancing how we all see our city of Melbourne. But it's not about final outcomes. It's about experimentation and trialling of ideas and taking creative risks, akin to an in situ micro-residency focused on the process rather than the final result. Through Test Sites, we see a city that crackles with possibility for artists to test ideas, interpret spaces and invent new experiences. It's only launched last week, and Test Sites will be run as a 1-year pilot, so we are also experimenting alongside you as we invite you to experiment in the city. So we hope to talk to you further, and this slide just gives you a rundown of all the dates. So please make contact with us. We'd really love to hear from you.
Thank you, Lynda. Our next speaker is Dr. Christian Thompson. He is an Australian-born, London-based contemporary artist. You've been back for a week, is that right? Still battling a bit of jet lag? A month and a half. Oh, you'll be right then. You missed the London heat wave. That was hilarious. It's an Australian-born, London-based contemporary artist whose work explores notions of identity, cultural hybridity and history. Formerly trained as a sculptor, Thompson's multidisciplinary practice engages mediums such as photography, video, sculpture, performance and sound. In 2010, he made history when he became the first Aboriginal Australian to be admitted into the University of Oxford in its 900-year history. He holds a doctorate of philosophy and fine art and many, many, many other qualifications that would take me until that Tuesday to read out. Let's just say he's a bit of show-off and has multiple things framed on his wall. His works are held in major international and national collections, and I tried to find a theme song for you. I literally was at a complete loss and Googled theme songs about a sculptor. And I got someone doing macrame on YouTube to windpipe music. I tried to bring it in, I'm just not good enough at technology. So in the end, I settled on Picasso Baby by Jay-Z, because that's a great song about all the pieces he wants to buy. He'll buy a Christian Thompson pretty soon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dr. Christian Thompson.
Thank you. I'm glad it's not Lionel Richie. That hello, that would have been a good one. Firstly, thank you for the invitation to come and speak. I'd also like to acknowledge the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people and the Greater Kulin Nation and thank Auntie Di for that very warm and generous welcome. I wasn't really prepared in terms of what I was going to speak about, and I sort of thought maybe perhaps what I could bring is more of a kind of international sort of perspective as someone who's sort of been moving between Europe and Melbourne for the last decade or so. I think in terms of kind of imagining the future of art, I was thinking about that, in fact, there are two kinds of things that we're sort of imagining. One is the sort of future of art as a kind of critical, cultural commodity, but also as the kind of infrastructure to one as a kind of form of critical engagement, but also the other thing is about the as an economic cultural industry. It's something that provides cultural nourishment, and it's a mirror of society that we use as a tool to imagine the society that we want to become. Something that I thought of was something that Grayson Perry recently said when he was addressing Boris Johnson in London, and said that rich people don't create culture. When talking about housing affordability, and that in fact the sort of inner city boroughs of London have become culturally barren. He described them as deserts devoid of culture. And so I think even though London kind of operates as a kind of interesting sort of conceptual space to work out of, it's not really as practical as a user-friendly operational space. And the trend of artists moving into inner city areas, bringing the cultural diversity, bringing the cultural economy, and then people with wealth moving in and gentrifying those areas and pushing artists further and further out of the inner city boroughs. So East London was kind of the the place that most artists would go and work, and now people are moving further and further out to sort of Peckham, Dulwich, and Streatham. And so it's created this kind of this sort of cycle where you end up with the inner city boroughs becoming like almost airports or sort of shopping centres with no real discernible cultural atmosphere at all. But it's not all bad news, and actually I think when Eleni was talking about what you're doing, there's also a program in London called Newfound Guardians, where they actually bring artists into commercial spaces to occupy those spaces, to care for those spaces, but also to give people affordable studio space. I think, I moved to Melbourne in 1998 or 99, I can't remember, from regional Queensland. And the reason that I moved to Melbourne was because it was, at that time, a very, the cultural kind of centre of Melbourne. I was lucky enough to get into the honours program at RMIT. And so that was the kind of appeal of Melbourne at that time. And while I think it's really important to think about the sort of economic gains of having a diverse and rich artistic scene, it's also important to think about how that provides opportunities for inclusion and how it provides ways of defining what Melbourne is as a city, and also in terms of the decisions that we make now will ultimately define the kind of city that Melbourne will be in another 10 years. I'm someone who's actually gained a lot by living and working in Melbourne, and I hope that the decisions that we make now will actually afford future generations also the ability to benefit from that from having a very diverse artistic community. I think artist-run spaces such as Space, West Space, King's, CCP and Gertrude Contemporary have been vital in terms of keeping the inner city boroughs or suburbs as vibrant, dynamic, culturally and critically engaged centres. And I know that those spaces are now struggling with whether they're actually going to be able to stay in the inner city areas. So I do think it is a responsibility of the local governments and also federal government in terms of investing not just in art as something that has a cultural return but also an economic return, and making sure that we include everybody in that process.